Good morning. My name is Robert Morris, and I run a YouTube channel called the More Freedom Foundation. I'm also a huge history... let's see how this works. Oh, there we go. Technology, it's important. I run a YouTube channel called the More Freedom Foundation, and I'm also kind of a huge history nerd. So I use my channel to try and bring some historical consciousness into our discussions of politics and current events. History is supposedly very important in US politics. In the United States, we worship the Founding Fathers. Oh, there we go. We worship the Founding Fathers. These are the guys who won our War of Independence and wrote our Constitution. They are everywhere. We name streets, think tanks, and universities after them. The most popular Broadway show of 2016, the biggest Broadway musical, is based on the life of... Towards you? That'll do it. Based on the life of this guy, Alexander Hamilton, who is basically a lawyer and bureaucrat who died over 200 years ago. Today, I'd like to start off by talking about one of the claims that the modern Republican Party makes about the Founding Fathers. If you watch Fox News, you'll get the sense that America's Christian identity is under siege. They love talking about the war on Christmas and insist that the Founding Fathers intended the United States to be a Christian nation. This idea has made its way into our schools. The Texas State Board of Education now requires that all U.S. history textbooks mention the Bible and say that the founders were biblically inspired. Now, I'm a pretty anti-organized religion kind of guy, and I'd love to tell you that this is all some kind of crazy myth, but I can't. The sad fact is that most of the Founding Fathers were a lot more serious about their Christianity than anybody is today. I mean, yes, it's true that Thomas Jefferson took a razor blade to his Bible and cut out all the magic bits. But that's just one guy. And if you think about it, isn't rewriting the Bible kind of a super Christian thing to do? We have to remember that the Founding Fathers lived in the 1700s. Many of them were deep into anti-religious Enlightenment ideas, but at the end of the day, their lives were focused on the church and the Bible. That's just what the 1700s were like, especially in a country where half the states were founded by religious fundamentalists. So when the Republicans talk about this, they're not actually wrong, but I think they're missing something that's very, very important. When the Founding Fathers sat down to write the Constitution, they didn't do it as Christians, I would argue. They did it as pagans. The most important influence on the thinking on government of the Founding Fathers was not Jesus. It was ancient Rome and Greece. Back before the 20th century, you couldn't consider yourself an educated person unless you knew a ton about the civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean and the institutions that they used to govern themselves. I'm going to guess that most people in this room are aware that Rome was a republic before it was an empire, and that democracy has something to do with ancient Greek city-states? Something like that? But 100 years ago, a similarly educated group of people sitting in a room like this would have known about the fall of the Roman Republic in great detail. They also would have known a ton about Athenian democracy, why it was strong, and why it went away. Let's do a quick show of hands. If I call George Washington, the first president of the United States, George Washington, if I call him the American Cincinnatus, does that mean anything to any of you? That is pretty much what I expected. So it may seem a bit ambitious to explain the importance of ancient history in a 15-minute TED Talk, but let's give it a try. The most important thing about this history is that it ended. These societies had institutions that were in some ways very similar to our own, and these institutions failed. Studying Greece and Rome allows us to see the full life cycle of governing institutions, from their beginnings to their ends. The most important example for the Founding Fathers was probably Rome. So back around where myth starts to become history, the Romans were governed by kings. The kings did a pretty bad job, so they kicked them out and started a republic. This institution lasted for almost 500 years. It was constantly changing, and it was a very, very different animal from the republics we have today, but it was an institution of representative government. And it made Rome very, very powerful. They first consolidated control over the Italian peninsula. Then, in an incredible 200-year run, they took over the entire known world. But the institutions that made Rome strong did not survive their success. By the time they'd completed their control of the ancient Mediterranean, Rome had degenerated back into an absolute monarchy. The Founding Fathers knew this history very well, and they had their own theories about why the Republic had fallen. What they learned from this is that our governing institutions are very, very fragile, and they have to be well designed. Some of them actually learned about the fall of the Romans in the Romans' own language. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution. He was a wealthy Virginian who went on to become the 4th president of the United States. He read, wrote, and fluently spoke Latin, Ancient Greek, and Hebrew. He's obviously kind of an overprivileged outlier, but any founding father that went to university would have had some familiarity with these languages. Alexander Hamilton has recently become newly famous as a hardscrabble immigrant and self-made man. But before he could attend what eventually became Columbia University, he too had to take remedial classes in Latin and Greek. He too had to take classes in remedial Latin and Greek. The Founding Fathers were an elite. They were sort of on top, but their knowledge of Greece and Rome filtered down to the general public. One of the most well-known nicknames that George Washington used to have was the American Cincinnatus. This refers to a Roman general who won a great victory for Rome and then went on to give up his power and return to his farm. The 19th century US citizen knew that our institutions were fragile, and they recognized that the greatest gift that George Washington gave to his country was voluntarily giving up power. They honored him with the highest compliment that they could think of. Highest compliment that they could think of. Oh, nope, that's not it. There. A comparison to ancient Roman virtue. A few movies and TV shows aside, this consciousness of Greece and Rome has faded over the past couple hundred years. But as recently as a generation or two ago, most of the people making our laws in the United States and Europe would have been aware of this history. So, how are we doing today? About 5 years back, I was lucky enough to get a tour of the US Capitol from a Republican congressman. He recently gave up his seat, but he helped to make my country's laws for almost 20 years, and he helped to shape the national conversation. When he got us to the chamber of the House of Representatives, he sat us down and he pointed out a relief that was hanging in the back of the chamber. He then engaged in what I imagine is a pretty standard set of Republicans giving a tour talking points. When we sit in this chamber and we make our laws, we know that Moses is looking down on us because America is a Christian nation. So when he finished his speech, I asked him a simple question. So who are all these other guys? He had absolutely no idea. These reliefs have an interesting history. When the House chamber was remodeled in 1949, these guys were installed. They depict 23 famous lawgivers from the history of Western civilization. 2 of them are ancient Greeks, and 4 of them are Roman. Interestingly, they also include a Muslim caliph. I'm not sure many congresspeople are aware of that. Moving back to our congressman, I think it's very telling that he had no idea who any of these people were. Jesus is important to US institutions, but ancient Greece and Rome are much, much more important. I consider myself sort of a wannabe classicist. I don't speak Latin or Greek, but I find these civilizations endlessly fascinating. I've read a bunch of books, a ton of Wikipedia, and I've probably listened to a couple hundred hours of lectures and podcasts at this point. 100 years ago, that would barely make me an amateur. But today, I'm afraid that that might put me in the top 1% as far as knowledge of these ancient civilizations goes. I'm also pretty confident that I know more about this stuff than 95% of the people in the US Congress, and probably more than the majority of European parliamentarians as well. This is a real problem. It's not that I want our legislators to speak ancient Greek. That would be ridiculous. But I do think that there needs to be a much deeper knowledge of Greece and Rome. I'm not talking about togas and gladiators here. It's the institutions that are important. Republics and democracies have been tried before, and they failed spectacularly. The Founding Fathers were very aware of this. And so were most of the people running the world until up about 50 years ago. What they knew is that our governing institutions are fragile. They need to be protected, both in their design and also in each new generation. That is what the Greeks and Romans can teach us. I think we're losing touch of that. I think we're losing touch with that idea in Western civilization. It's been about 150 years since the US governing institutions were seriously challenged, and it's been about 70 years in Western Europe. We've gotten too complacent. We seem to think that these institutions will always be there. If ancient history teaches us anything, it's that that is certainly not true. I think that most of what we argue about seems to come from this complacency. Take the European project, for example. Its sort of thoughtless acceleration in the 1990s, followed by its even more thoughtless disintegration in this decade, are perfect examples of the things that can only happen when people aren't paying any attention to the fragility of our institutions. The 2016 presidential election in the United States is an even better example. People just seem to think that our systems will always be here, and seem to have the idea that handing our institutions over to a charismatic strongman would be a good idea. That's madness. But I think we've all got a little bit of that madness in us. The best way that I can see to fight against this madness is to study ancient Greece and ancient Rome. I started off today talking about something that Republican congressmen are missing, but I think I've arrived at something that we're all missing. We all need to know more about these civilizations. They were very different from our own, but they had institutions that were very similar. These institutions failed. If we want to keep our institutions from doing the same thing, then we've all got to know more about Greece and Rome. Thank you.